as I said, I met Qasim over 20 years ago, and it's quite interesting story actually. I was doing a performance. I believe he had seen me dance before, but I was dancing in Birmingham, I think it was. And after the performance, Nahid Siddiqui, who is Qasim's Kathak mentor and guru, came to see me backstage, and with her, she brought this man who I didn't know, but had such an impact on me. Really, I mean, that kind of lasted in my mind for a long time, and then I bumped into him somewhere else, and this kept happening every few years, where I would just be randomly walking on Old Compton Street, for example, and suddenly Qasim would come, and the impact was so big, you know, and a meeting led to eventually, you know, spending some time together for a few days, into a few years later, into a few weeks. And one day I had I'd gone back to Malaysia for a year, and I was walking in a shopping mall in Malaysia, and there was Qasim in Malaysia, and we spent a substantial amount of time there together. And I think what I would say is, every time I met him, there was a new Qasim, and yet it was Qasim. And so there's a core, I think, that is very interesting, that is very specifically anchored in an identity that allows itself to transform every time. And you are kind of pulled into this transformation as well. And I think that always kind of leads into what his work is, which for me is framed essentially first and foremost by his parents, Nahid, and a kind of clarity of identity that is absolutely convinced in ambiguity and not being defined on all levels. And in Malaysia, when we were together, I was doing a work, and so it was the first time, because really most of our kind of connection was personal, but there we did end up working together on something that I was doing. And it was very interesting for me, because I really, as a classical dancer, which was the work I was doing at that point, I think what he kind of instigated in me was to really question my perceptions of what was classical as opposed to what was the classicism of the work I was doing. And what I mean by that was, he really kind of forced me to look at all the codes that defined what was classical, and made me question if it was necessary to be present in my work in order for me to embody classicism, which is a huge question for any classical dancer, and at the same time tremendously liberating when you understand that those codes are not necessary, actually. So he was very influential in kind of, I think, for me as an artist, kind of really making me transcend into a different place and a different kind of relationship with my work. And I think with him, particularly with the relationship that he has with Nahid, I think that the influence of that relationship in his work, which comes from a place of love and kind of romantic devotion. You know, I don't think he's scared of demonstrating romanticism within the most urban of representation. And that's kind of a very interesting juxtaposition that he forces you to kind of confront.
One of the things that I enjoyed most about the book, about which I enjoyed many things, was a record of a period of time. Just riffing on the word transformation, as well as your work being very much in each piece about the possibility of change, if that's what transformation essentially means. We've both lived through a period of quite extraordinary change and changed relationship with mainstream culture in particular. We're both queer artists of different generations, but similar generations, where we can remember a time when to propose your work as queer immediately caused trouble. Sometimes creative trouble, and sometimes just really horrible, painful inhibiting destructive trouble. And we are now in a place where our queerness is often welcomed as an asset instead of being defined as a problem. And I find it very heartening that your work has brought you, and by inference us, queer people, by which I mean queer people, to a place where instead of going, okay, we've arrived and we can all relax now, because the point of this journey of transformation was simply to say there was a bit of a problem around queer and we've solved it, instead of which, by your work being a pathway which was constantly about change, in every encounter between the viewer and your work, you have to engage in not just witnessing transformation, but beginning to think about your own potential to transformation. So we find ourselves at this glorious place in history where instead of going, oh, we can stop all that transformation nonsense now because we've arrived, we go, now we have all of the heritage and the skill and the emotional investment in the idea of change. Let's now see where the next dance takes us, where the next transformation takes us. And I think there's an edge of excitement and potential to the moment that we're living in now. A shorter way of saying all of that would be, I can't wait to see what you make next. There we go.
There's a particular essay in the book by a dear mutual friend, sadly no longer with us, Oliver Winchester, who we were working together with at the Victorian Albert Museum at the time when Qasim came through the door of my office, through the doors of the museum, at a moment nearly 10 years ago when the museum was in a great moment of change, a very positive moment of change. Oliver was particularly instrumental in opening up the museum in his events at the evening, where he brought a radical vision into an institution that wasn't so radical at the time, and Qasim's work and performance there was integral to that. So it was a real moment of challenge to the institution. And the project we were working on at the time, which rather academically and dully was called Fashioning Diaspora Space, good God, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, was a way of challenging the collecting practices of the museum in relation to particularly the textiles that had come from the region through the 19th century, being cut up and abused and pulled apart from the subcontinent in all sorts of ways. We were able to make these strange connections between that troubling history, economic, political and social, to something that was hugely dangerous, celebratory around West London bridal shops and drawing, around the way that people's wardrobes connect between moments in history and questions of identity, and Qasim's work was central to that. So Oliver's essay reminded me of all of that, but of course Qasim's work is part of that process, and as Neil says, that was a moment 10 years ago where you could take a lot for granted about the progressive, powerful feeling of change in institutions. We're in a slightly more troubling moment now, but the fact that the book is there, and the dialogues are there in the book, and the work is there, gives great hope, actually. And I know a whole new wave of work is happening across museums and collections and their relation to performance and contemporary practice at the moment that is pushing at the boundaries again. So hurrah for that.
I think one of the things about the book that I really appreciated, and I think it is, in many ways it's doing a lot of things simultaneously, as the work is as well, is that there is this sort of zooming out from the microcosm of Qasim in your work and where it comes from and the kind of incredible details of that. And this kind of, zooming out to the macro and what it means for the viewer and for wider society, if we're going to be if we're going to go that far. And I think that at the moment, there's a lot to be said about transgression, changing identities, non-binary possibilities, global identities, change, selection, and kind of integration of these changes as well, and how we adapt and create spaces or function within new openings in society that are maybe newly visible openings in society. And I think that a lot of live art is moving towards those questions, not necessarily finding answers, but I think asking questions in ways that people can connect to in a sort of effectual way and see themselves in, as much as sort of having something projected towards them as well. So that exchange on a social level, I think, is something that your work will continue to find relevance for that already exists, but I imagine we'll also find future audiences in as well.
How Qasim uses classical dance and a choreographic sensibility. How, from what you've seen of his work with working, can you illuminate how that actually functions when we see it on a screen or in a performance and so on?
The first thing I would say is the clarity of intention.
Okay.
I think the absolute precision in terms of that every sense of gesture or movement is defined by a clear sense of intention that is very specifically directed in terms of the dramaturgy of whatever is kind of being developed, and that is absolutely honest to him in that moment. So I think that is the first thing. The second thing is, which I wanted to say earlier, it's a bit more ambiguous, but I think it's very important. And again, it is related to his relationship with Naheed, where I think the lineage of his training, right, is one that really comes from a place that doesn't define a separation between the personal and the performer. Naheed is very much like this. She is an embodied construct of her art, and I think Qasim really comes from that line of lineage. So, and it's an interesting thing because if I'm very honest, I don't think it's something that is genuinely understood in the West very often, because in the West we are defined by a structure that tells us when we work and when we don't, when we have our time. And of course, I always refer to it as the South Asian spine is one that doesn't have this separation. And I think, I know it's a very ambiguous kind of philosophical thing that I'm saying, but for me, it is so defined in his work, and in actuality, all the costumes, which are a very big part of it, I think he's very intelligent in understanding that they are still performative. Mm-hmm. And they are performative to a much more clear spine that is constant.
It's going to make me sound horribly vulgar. I think I responded to seeing the way that Qasim was using, especially fabric and stitching, putting things together and pulling things apart. I remember that piece we talked about earlier this evening, a piece that was in the Third Eye Centre in Glasgow, which was using dolls, miniature mannequins and hair in a very strange and alarming reconfiguration. It was like seeing the insides of something pulled out, things that had been hidden in stuffing. And I come out of a completely different tradition of dressing up. I spent my 20s living on the Isle of Dogs, where dressing up was about a very hardcore, old school tradition of British working class drag. and glamour drag, and for me to see a completely separate tradition which had nothing to do with the tradition that I knew of, but still came down to the same material fact of a man caring about sewing. I remember just responding to that, of going, this is a world which has no tangible connection that I can make on the level of the different traditions of queer culture across the world, but in the end it comes down to a man stitching, and the sort of hypnotic, laborious, always hidden labour of fabric that I think you're in love with. I responded to that very deeply. I also respond very strongly to what you say about that spine is a good word for secure identity. People think, those of us who are engaged in the business of transformation and opening up the world to transformation, that somehow means we're confused. Wrong.
What I think is, what is fascinating is with his work there is that aspect, and also the feature that I relate to a lot is also his text, because he writes a lot, and the text and the aspect with the kind of multiplicities of identities that which has always struck me as fascinating, that he doesn't leave stuff out. Somebody else might leave some references out because what will be the balance with the other references? Qasim does not. He keeps them in. And I think there's something quite fascinating about what you had mentioned, this aspect that, there's a certain confidence to be able to say, no, it's here. Yes, it's here. It's part of what I'm thinking about and saying, and it is here. Yes, and also the ambiguity. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, Neil, in particular, and here's having written a question. So, what is Qasim's queer? And, more significantly, how do we speak about queer histories and legacies from one generation to the next?
Oh Lord. I wouldn't presume to be able to answer the question, what is Qasim's queer? Except I think I would say to anyone who asked me that, well, here is the work. I think that's what I would say in answer to that. How we talk about queer from one generation to the next is very important to me right at the moment, because I'm just turned 60. And for the first time I received an invitation to talk at Lesbian and Gay History Month. And I asked them what they wanted me to talk about, and they said, gay history. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, you. So that put me in my place. I think the transmission from generation to generation is vitally important, and I wish we would talk more about how transmission is physical and literal. But one of the most crucial things that happens is the relationship between a younger man and a much older man. And it happens in all sorts of ways. It can be a sexual relationship or a teaching relationship, or often a mixture of the two. And there is nothing like being with an older body or seeing an older embodied practice. And so having an older man teach you to dance or make love, or cook, or hang a picture, or run a dinner party, or stage an argument, any of the material, tangible life skills, I think these are how we pass on queer culture in a progressive way. I think something that really fascinates me about Qasim's work, and that I'm deeply envious of and can't pretend to understand, is the influence on his work of having a primary anchoring relationship in his life between yourself and your Kathak teacher. And that, because I'm someone who had to, in order to survive, walk away from my religious upbringing and from all of the mainstream cultural upbringing, or as I like to call it, indoctrination that I was given as a child. And I've had to forge my identity really within the world of the avant-garde and its appropriation of popular culture, but not within mainstream high culture at all. And so that idea of having a lifelong, intimate, physical relationship with one teacher who gives you an understanding that you continually can return to for your understanding that first of all you are a queer body and everything else comes from inhabiting your own body in a very specific, in this case, rhythmic and intentional and fully systemized way. I find that completely fascinating and inspiring, but I think it does provide a very important model for the idea of queer transmission. That, for me, it comes down to older bodies teaching younger bodies how to live. That's something I really believe in, and I look back at my own young manhood and now I understand a lot of what was going on then much better, and I realise how valuable were all the people who I now call my aunties and my mothers, who are gay men who are 30, 40, sometimes 50, almost. I have a really good friend who's in his late 90s, so he's 40 years older, 40-something years older than me. So those are incredibly important relations.
I know that because I've read your book on British Asian style, and what I wanted to turn to is this aspect of what Qasim has in his work.
The book was a while ago. It's a very fragmentary book. It scratches the surface in many ways, but it does make some interesting connections. There was one essay in it, I think, that relates to Qasim's work on wardrobes and the way that memories are accrued through wardrobes, and of course the work that Qasim did in terms of the memory of his mother's dress and his embodiment of that is a very real instance of connection, familial connection, memory and inhabitation and learning, going back to some of Neil's comments on how generations move through generations, and clothes do that as mementos, as reminders, as tangible objects of transmission, fragmentary objects that have lost their meaning in many ways, but through the trace of a smell, through the fall of fabric across the shape of a body that works differently on other bodies, through the representation of those fabrics and objects, through family photographs, and all of that comes together to make something whole and to make connections. And I think that particular work did that. I have to say, in the book, the dolls at the beginning, just been doing some work on Florine Stettheimer and the work she did in New York in the 30s, that powerful Four Saints in 3 acts with Gertrude Stein, indeed, and they suddenly reminded me of the little models she made for the actors from Harlem who playing all of the roles in that fantastic opera that opened a new modern art gallery, and I thought, yeah, that's it. That was little bits of hair, gemstones, rough stitching in a way, although I'm sure they're very well made, giving an idea. And that's where history connects through fabric, material, memory, queer histories, in very interesting ways.
One of the things that has clearly been very important is Qasim's relationship with his parents. And in the exhibition at Manchester were some of his father's artworks. Okay. And also that lovely discussion on the sun lounges. But also what this is how memory enters into pieces of work one does, including with the movement, the dance, the structure of the piece at the Asia Triennale, because I want to turn slightly to the performance pieces, where you often have the audience engaged one-to-one, as installation, and how that works in the context of how we think of the performative, which you of course work with. So if you would, and Mavin too.
I think one of my favourite kind of untranslatable phrases is Freudian, but I think it's not necessarily rooted in his use of it, which is Naturagleichheit, which was roughly translates as deferred action, but there isn't actually a direct translation of it in English. And it's basically the concept that when we encounter memory, especially in a physical space, as a body, and maybe encountering another body, or encountering a position which positions us in relation to someone else's memory, that there is a exchange and a work that goes on that fundamentally kind of changes who we are in that moment. And I think that even though I didn't see the performances, I think the video work I saw from the Corner House exhibition felt really rife with that deferred action. This sort of returning, it's a cyclical concept of returning and becoming that memory is, I think, in so many ways. And I think that the performance and the becoming and cyclical becoming is really at the centre of so much of what you do. That in the particular relationship to thinking about our parents, and I say our because you can't help but watch those works and start investigating your own relationship to your parents, or your mothers and aunties, whichever figures they might be, you had these kind of profound relations in your life with. So I think that one of my keen interests in performance art is its potential to create deferred action or Naturagleichheit in not only the artists themselves, but also the audience, and a kind of embodying of memory as experience in the present as much as returning to the past. I don't know if I explained that very well, but I think that's something that I can't escape in the work that I've encountered of yours.
I have to say this, when I met Qasim, I think 1 or 2 years older than me, so we were both in our 20s, and I was in London, and when I met him, I was a young, Londoner who was really claiming and embracing what I defined as my queerness in London, as a Londoner, and club culture and queer culture, whatever that means at that time. And when I met him, I remember that it was so frustrating because it was impossible to pin him down with every cliche that within the culture that I was kind of embracing defined. I couldn't pin him down. What was he? From in all areas, in terms of my relationship with him, in terms of his physicality that was transformative all the time. In all areas, and that for me was so frustrating as a young man. But of course, that itself was the queerest of queer. That he couldn't be pinned down, and he was beyond all the cliches that the community kind of instilled in me as a young man. And I think with that queerness came a clarity of being, to be. And it's very interesting that performance of the one-to-one encounter, because of course anyone who meets Qasim, it is one-to-one. Even in the most busiest space, it is very much a one-to-one interaction. You're drawn into him. And so for me, that project was very, very reflective of really who he is, very much. And the relationship with his parents, I've had the privilege of seeing a lot, and really of his relationships. I think he, again, is an artist like many sublime artists, really, who have this ability to understand that their construct, their bodies, if you touch them, really are echoes of voices of memories. And they kind of allow it to be a vessel for those voices to speak through their work, which is actually their lives. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And I think that in relation to the work and how the performances are constructed, and what we haven't spoken of much is, and then I'll have others ask questions, is how central text is to his work, and how particular his text is. I say that having had to memorize monologues. Yes, and you suddenly realize the syntax, and you think, how am I going to put those two things that seemingly don't go together, but yet he's put them together?
Can I say something about that? Because I think from my perspective, of course, again, he is a student of Nahid Siddiqui, who is one of the most supreme performers of a genre of Indian classical dance called Abhinaya. And Abhinaya is essentially when you take text and you develop a whole series of poetic metaphors through dance to interpret, for example, a single line. So the text is crucial, but the understanding of the text in order to, in the moment, create over many, many times, subtext to the text is really the skill. So from my perspective, he comes from a lineage that looks at text as a form of creation from a subtextual manner.
Okay. Neil?
I think that's fascinating to hear about that particular tradition, which I didn't know about. I think, yes, I think I identify very much with that. Too often people think that artists who are dealing with autobiographical material, however obliquely and subtly, that their expression is confessional. And it's really important that you remind us that actually, often the work is extremely intricately constructed within certain received traditions. So my own work is often in the same way layered. When I published my second novel, my publisher said, do you think it would be a good idea to give people notes about where a lot of this material came from? For instance, all of the characters in the novel have their names taken from other queer novels published over the last 250 years. And I said, well, we could try and do that, but it turned out that would require 42 pages of notes, so we let that one drop. So I think it's really valuable to be reminded behind the apparent simplicity of the speaking voice. Again, there's all of this embroidery, there's a palimpsest of text, just as there is of colour or texture or gesture.
Hello everybody. I do feel, I have to say, that I have somewhat died a little bit. and I'm hearing about myself, so it's a very out-of-body experience right now. But it's not too far away from the way that I have made work over the last 20 years, which is kind of querying the queer in Qasim, and to the point of annihilation. So how do I begin when I no longer exist? And I think a lot of the, first of all, I'm so thankful and grateful that you've all come and you're speaking about the work with such relationship to it, not just of the work itself, but bringing your own memoryscapes to that.
So, what are your thoughts? And in a way, I suppose you know, because you know what some of the work has been, as kind of future thoughts for the notion of a next phase.
Oh gosh, well, one of the things I was thinking in response to what I heard you say, the conversation, was that custom masks and costumes are a kind of activity in the queer theory sense, in that everything we are, everything that we think of as our identity, is performed. And I think Custom's book does paradoxical, is that it is an obvious drama, an obvious expression of new or other identity. At the same time, that calling attention to the ways that even our true selves, right, real identity, the ways that we know ourselves, that others know us, are equally important. So I can imagine that the next phase will be something both recognizable, because that's what Qasim does in his work, but new, because we haven't seen every facet of what he can convey, express, and perform as still Qasim.
I think on that note, and also what was great is the bits that were missed out, which I quite enjoyed. At any rate, some final comments?
Oh.
Yes, for each of us.
Well, I think for me, what's as always with Qasim, it's what has always been fascinating is that the fact that he really challenges consistently, and because of that challenge, there's a questioning that allows for something to evolve.
I guess I'll probably just sort of follow what your dad said to you in the video, which wasn't good on you, mate, which I do appreciate. But when he says that you have the courage of conviction, and I think that's really at the core of what makes your artwork so successful. And I think you're not going to lose that anytime soon, or one would hope not. So I think that is almost a guarantee that what happens next will be important and exciting and hopefully sort of life-changing or transformative for the audiences that encounter it.
Well, I hope you haven't died. The course of this evening, I think it's been a very life-enhancing experience. My last word is actually on the book itself, which is such a beautiful object. And we talked a little bit about Manchester. It's Corner House.
Yes, it's Corner
Books,
House.
isn't it?
And the designer who
yeah.
has been, he can't, I had a text from him that he couldn't come today, but Michael's been just wonderful to work with.
Which took me right back, but thank goodness for the materiality of beautifully designed books with inspiring content, which it certainly has. So I grasp onto this. I have a copy, so I don't need to take this one. It's wonderful.
Just to echo that, don't worry about the being dead thing, mate. I mean, I do know about that, and I would just say, 46, relax. But it is weird. You go, am I in the past tense? Because who is this person that they refer to like this? But enjoy that, please own it, this beautiful achievement. But also just accept from us how necessary the work feels. The next 10 years are going to be fun for this country, and your work will take its place and it will help us. And that's a really good thing, a really important thing for you to know. And thank you for your work.